Well, there's been a lot of recent developments happening in the AI space over the past few weeks. Apple finally releasing its own artificial intelligence. Also, Google DeepMind made a pretty significant breakthrough that's getting researchers pretty excited. Of course, OpenAI is now making a move into search. To provide his analysis on this and more with us today is AI expert and researcher, Dr. Alan D. Thompson, one of the world's top-ranking researchers and consultants in the AI and robotics space. Alan, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Chris. Good times once again. Lovely to join you here from Brisbane in Australia.
Absolutely. And I just love our conversations and diving into all of your research because you really are on the cutting edge. You know, before we began, I was thinking, can you tell our audience a little bit about what you do, your newsletter, and the various people and organizations that follow your research?
Yeah, for sure. It's been pretty explosive over the last few years. If I take you all the way back to 2001, I did my very first degree in computer science and psychology there. Played around with Mensa International as the chairman for gifted families for quite a while. And I've always been intrigued by high performance, particularly how it maps to technology. So for the last 3 years, since GPT-3's release in 2020, I've been conducting independent research, providing analysis and estimates on data sets and real hands-on reports that are accessible to Fortune 500s. I advise more than half of the Fortune 500s out there, governments, large research teams and academic institutions. You'll find my stuff featured in places like NYU and MIT. The last year or so through 2024, has been, again, pretty loud. I'm doing some consulting and doing a big roundtable for seismic.com, which I think are around your way, Chris, out of San Diego. They're coming out here to Sydney and we'll play around with their team. And then a lot of our Australian CEOs from the ASX 100. But at the end of the day, my focus is on understanding more about large language models inside of the field of artificial intelligence and then allowing that to be visible to the general public.
And one of the really interesting things about your research is you're mapping all of these developments. You're providing really hard-hitting quantitative, qualitative data that's comparing all of the various companies and large language models. And so, I mean, the data sets that you're producing, the charts, the analysis is really, really valuable, especially if you are someone like working at Google or at OpenAI and you want to be looking at these developments. So that's something that I think that you do that sets you apart from probably all others out there.
Yeah, look, it's very exciting for me to be able to live in this time and to be able to have access to the kind of things that we have access to right now. If you look at other fields like physics or biology, it might be that some of their data sets or some of their research stays proprietary, stays internal. For some reason, in artificial intelligence, we've got access to what is actually happening in the labs via their papers and technical reports, but we also have complete access to go and play with these models. So right now, you can go and use GPT-4o Mini for free, or you can go and use Claude 3.5 Sonnet, or you can go and use Google Gemini and be hands-on with these models that probably cost in the order of hundreds of millions and coming up on billions of dollars to train. And you can use it in your lounge room or in your office.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. And as I've mentioned in the past, the way I found out about your work was, you were getting millions of views on YouTube because of all the different interviews that you were doing with AI and really trying to, let's say, how do we put it, test the limits or just how far these AI models are able to go in terms of their creativity, their response times. So tell us a little bit about, some of those early days with Lita.
Lita AI was born in early 2021, I think it was. I was invited to present at the World Gifted Conference, with my Mensa backing and my research into human intelligence over the last decade or so. And I thought, well, human intelligence is kind of over. I had already published a paper called The New Irrelevance of Intelligence. And I decided to really talk about that in the context of co-presenting with a real AI. So we used GPT-3, the frontier model at the time, only 175 billion parameters, so maybe 10% of the size of models today. And we put an avatar, human-like avatar on top of it. And away we went. And it was so popular that we ended up doing 67 episodes together, me and Lita AI. And it was viewed, as you say, about 4 or 5 million times. It's part of the Internet Archive now and has been featured by ABC. Lita was named after one of my, well, I don't know if you'd call it contemporaries, one of the original human intelligence researchers, Professor Lita Hollingworth from the 1920s. And in a lot of ways, it broke the same sort of ground that Lita Hollingworth was doing. Lita AI was probably the first time that we were interacting with large language models in a conversational way and exploring the intelligence of that model. I do want to mention that one of the conversations that I had with Lita AI in 2021 was about hooking it up to my brain, giving it various scenarios. So maybe walking into a boardroom, maybe having an argument with a partner, maybe walking through a park, and then Lita AI via GPT-3 giving me the best responses for those scenarios. And it was a lot of fun. She gave a lot of different responses that were all really rigorous, really backed by some sort of credibility, and they were interesting. Just recently, just in the last week, Synchron here in Australia have come up with an integration between their brain-machine interface, so it's something that is inside people's heads in Australia as we speak, linked into GPT-4o. So that integration is working. You can see people playing with it, and it's almost exactly what we were doing with Lita. They get a few different options to respond every time they hear a question in a conversation or even see something in the world. They get different tiles to choose from to respond to that scenario. I thought that was fascinating. It only took 3 years, but we've now got brain-machine interfaces hooked up to large language models that respond in the same way that we were doing 3 years ago.
That is just so mind-blowing, and I'm glad you brought that up because, I mean, in 2021, when you were discussing that with Lita, and again, Lita was an AI avatar. So like you said, this full-on conversational format with AI back and forth in real time. And, she was presented as an AI avatar. You're talking about the potential of hooking GPT into the brain using a brain-machine interface. That at the time sounded like it was so sci-fi, so far into the future. It only took 3 years. That's wild.
Yeah, it really is. And it seemed sci-fi 3 years ago. It's still sci-fi for me, even to watch these guys, typing a message using their brain, or again, picking from the scenarios using their brain. Some of them, including the guy who's testing Elon's Neuralink, use it for playing games, use it for having conversations, use it for arguing with people without lifting a finger, without opening their mouths. It's fascinating.
Is it basically two kind of companies here that are really making headway here, Synchron and then Neuralink? Are those the two main ones now?
They're the two ones that are top of my mind. Of course, there are dozens in the BCI space or BMI space, brain-computer interface or brain-machine interface. There are even those that are concentrating on having non-surgical BCIs. So Neuralink does go through the skull. You need to drill out a little part of the brain. Synchron is inserted a little bit differently. It almost goes through the jugular. But we're talking about now labs that are exploring putting on a hat or using LED light to integrate with the brain. I think that's going to be far more acceptable to the general public, but it just means there are a lot of companies competing now in this space.
How do you see this proceeding, Alan? Because at this point, I know with, for example, Neuralink, most of the focus is on alleviating certain neurological issues, right? So the one, I forget the name of the person that got the first implant, but of course, he's a paraplegic, and so he can't use his limbs. So he has that Neuralink implant directly into his brain. It allows him to interact with a computer using his own thoughts, right? Just mind-blowing stuff here. How do you see these things proceeding? Do you see it going from helping assist people with disabilities and then eventually moving into augmentation? I mean, how do you see that evolving moving forward?
This is one of my favorite topics at the moment. I've just been invited to present at the 31st Symposium of Psychiatry about this, which is the combination, or my keynote will be on the combination of these BCIs and large language models, you're right that we did want to resolve disabilities and disorders initially. So there are resolutions to paralysis or memory loss. We've looked at getting rid of, or at least overcoming disorders, including insomnia, seizures, addiction. Then next up, we're going to be exploring getting around learning difficulties and even enhancing humans through amplification of things like memory, creativity, enhanced thinking in general, and I know this one's sci-fi, thought transfer as well.
So again, we're already seeing these things applied to resolving certain disabilities. And it only took 3 years, again, from the point where you were discussing this with AI to the point where we're now seeing this implemented with people. Things are moving very fast. How long do you think we could get before we're addressing some of those things that you just listed, learning difficulties, enhancing creativity, or just thinking in general? I mean, is that another maybe 3 to 5 years from here?
That's a bit difficult to guess. I know that we've pretty much resolved some of the disabilities, including paralysis, including getting around people who've had strokes, playing around with helping people who have some sort of brain issue and then allowing them to live a normal life. We've explored playing around with some of the disorders, and I think Elon has mentioned that this will be his next exploration. I'm not sure how long it'll take for us to be able to amplify or enhance our own abilities. At the moment, I think BMIs get through FDA approval or medical approval or even public approval because they're helping people with disabilities live better lives. I'm not sure how acceptable it's going to be to almost create these sci-fi humans, but it is coming up next. Let's see. I'm hesitant to guess on that one because in some ways, society, particularly with politics and governance, moves a lot slower than it should. That doesn't mean the technology will move a lot slower. Some of these guys have been in the research phase or the R&D phase for a decade. We can take Mary Lou Jepson's open water all the way back to 2015, 2016. So these have been played around with in labs for a long time. It's just that we're seeing them a lot more loudly, particularly in the case of people like Elon who want to get this out there and don't really care too much about the overarching regulations.
Yeah, that's a really good point here because the technology is going to be moving a lot faster than public policy and the public itself is, I think, prepared for. And I know this firsthand. I was discussing some of the developments with large language models just a couple years back, actually. And a lot of it coming from your work and your research with someone that worked deep within the government on this exact area when it comes to science and policy. And they actually did not know a lot of the information, a lot of the developments that were happening. And it was kind of eye-opening for me just to realize, wow, how far behind the curve some of that knowledge is when it comes to the technology and just how quickly it is moving. And I do want to point out, I suggested that they follow your work.
Look, I'm not surprised that government is behind, particularly with my insights into some of the major governments. It's, even in the US, you've got people through Congress working in technology that are not up to speed with basic technology. But then if you look at some of the major universities, they've had trouble keeping up. So their lecturers who might have studied in the 70s, 80s, and 90s think that neural networks in general are a bit of a dead end and have not kept up with the progress over the last 3 or 4 years. Now, what has happened in the last 3 or 4 years is so explosive as to overshadow everything since 1948 when Turing came up with the idea of intelligent machinery. So if you haven't kept up with, say, the last 36 months, it's almost like your knowledge set is irrelevant. And for professors, for senators, for politicians, or even for policy advisors, if they, again, have not kept up with that information, they're working with very, very old data, and I would say almost irrelevant data.
Absolutely. And this came out just from a conversation I was having with my Aussie friend. He's actually from Tasmania. Do you call people from Tasmania Aussies?
Yeah, they're Tassies. I was just down in Hobart actually for another keynote. Beautiful place, but really, really cold.
Yeah. So my Tasmanian friend, I was talking to him about some of the developments, and he himself was also poo-pooing artificial intelligence as saying that it's got a lot of major problems and kinks that still need to be worked through, and it has so much far to go. And I was just kind of telling him like, yes, but these will be worked out, and we can disagree on the timing as to how fast these things come to bear, but it's clear that the progress is up and to the right. And I want to bring in your recent memo newsletter. The top item that you just mentioned is a fascinating quote. And I know that this is getting a number of people pretty excited. Let me read here. You have a quote from a professor. This is the national coach of the United States International Mathematical Olympiad team. He says, quote, when people saw Sputnik in 1957, they might have had the same feeling that I have right now. Human civilization needs to move to high alert! Exclamation mark. Can you tell us about what we saw and why this is important?
Well, I can tell you what we saw from an analytical perspective, Chris, but I will note that maths is not my strong suit. So the 2024 International Mathematical Olympiad, the IMO exam, is huge. It's something that is really revered in math circles. You'll see Fields Medal winners who've also got gold medals at the IMO. We obviously enter in all sorts of different countries from around the world, and the gold medals are generally from one or two particular places. DeepMind, or Google DeepMind now, used two of their new AI systems to take the latest IMO exam. So that was administered to humans on the 16th of July, 2024. They took their two new systems, Alpha Geometry 2 and Alpha Proof, both backed by the new Google DeepMind Gemini model, which is only a few months old. And they ran the exam through these two systems. It scored about 2 points off a gold medal. It was awarded a silver medal performance as assessed by one of the official judges who already had taken the exam. So a score of 28 out of 42, silver medal performance. Gold medal performance is a score of 30 out of 42. But just phenomenal work because of how difficult the questions are. They are visual. The models and the humans have to look at the questions, but they're also designed for postdoctoral students. They're designed for the smartest people in the world, and the questions are at a level beyond what I could do, what any of my prodigies could do. There are only a handful of people in the world that can even attempt these questions.
So as you mentioned, it was just 2 points away from a gold medal, but it sounds like, at least from the quote that I just read and from your newsletter, this was unexpected.
For DeepMind, I'm pretty sure they would have expected it, but for people and the public, and for Professor Po Shen Lo, for the national coach of the IMO that you just quoted, and we had a couple of other professors saying this came out of nowhere. It certainly didn't come out of nowhere. The guys in London at DeepMind have been working on this for a decade or two, and it's really impressive to see just how far they've come.
So again, I think this illustrates the divide we see between those that are following really what's happening in these developments with artificial intelligence, and then those who may not be aware. And here you have the coach of the United States International Mathematical Olympiad team, like you pointed out. He obviously saw this as a very momentous development, something that took him certainly by surprise, saying that human civilization needs to move to high alert. But at the same time, we're seeing increasingly and incrementally AI beating humans on more and more and more tests across a wide range of areas. And that's something that your research and your work bears out so well because you track all of this. So kind of where would you say we're at currently, especially when we think about this idea of artificial general intelligence?
We're pretty close. I think in our last conversation, we already covered the Google Proof question and answer benchmark, where models like Claude and GPT-4 were getting close to PhD domain experts. So if you've got a doctorate in biology, you'd get about 65% on that benchmark. Just recently, just in the last few weeks, we do have a model that does outperform PhDs. So Claude 3.5 Sonnet gets 67.2% on that benchmark, smarter than someone with a doctorate in a specialist subject. That's just on one benchmark. I track them all over the place. I tracked one recently that I thought was really interesting. I think this is from July 2024. Scientists went and researched sense of humor or funniness, which from my perspective on human intelligence design, so giftedness, this is certainly something that we looked at during my postgraduate in gifted education, something that my colleague, Professor Mirka Gross, talked about. If a prodigy has a sense of humor that's adult level, that's usually one of the first indicators that they've got a very, very high IQ. In any case, these scientists went and compared funniness inside of models like GPT 3.5 and GPT 4 with humans and found that the models had a sense of humor or a funniness metric that was 20% higher than the human baseline. And we're seeing that across the board. We've seen that in essay writing, SAT exams, where GPT-4 is 34% higher than the human baseline. Even equities, share market investing, we can get 59% higher than the human baseline. Social intelligence, 50% higher than the human baseline. And the one that's probably the most shocking, I showed this recently to a room of surgeons and medical professionals, GPT-4 having 70% higher empathy than human doctors. It's got a lot more time to listen to you. It's also got infinite patience with how it actually comes up with responses. So it was judged as actually about 7.8 times higher prevalence of empathetic and very empathetic ratings in that assessment.
That's interesting. So, I mean, it spans the gamut because like what we're talking about here, when it even comes to mathematical intelligence, as we started off with the mathematical Olympiad, just 2 points from a gold medal. So it's excelling and continuing to advance in that area. At the same time, it also goes so far as when you're talking about creativity and empathy as well. So it's a very broad range of areas where we're seeing continual progress, if you want to put it that way. And it's really interesting because this is something that we've covered with you multiple times in the past, and I'd love to get updates from you on this. But tell us a little bit about your artificial general intelligence AGI countdown and where things are at currently.
There is an official AGI countdown. You can just Google AGI countdown. Actually, it's the top result. I call it the Allen's Conservative Countdown to AGI. I've been tracking this since 2020 or 2021. And it looks at each of the metrics, each of the milestones to get us to a system that can perform at the level of an average human. So think about an average human. They have an IQ of 100. They, based on quantification or based on statistics, they probably live in China or India. They may or may not have a car. They can't build a house, but they can put together IKEA furniture. So we've tried to quantify what the average human is. As of today, the end of July 2024, the AGI countdown or progress is at 76%, predicted to reach 100% perhaps sometime in 2025. And to get there, we don't need much more. We need these large language models to be built into humanoid robots, which is already happening so that they can actually interact with the world. And then you mentioned earlier that there are some things that we are concerned about, things like hallucinations and truthfulness, so that you can actually trust the outputs, allowing it to have awareness of where it is in space and just for it to get even smarter than it already is. And it is very smart right now. I talk about the fact that it has an IQ measured for verbal linguistics in the 99.99th percentile, an IQ of 155.
Wow. And you had said, correct me if I'm wrong, that your model is on track to hit 100%, you believe, by 2025. Did I get that correct?
At some time in 2025, it might be the end of the year. I'm not trying to match any particular timeline. I assign a percentage increase based on progress of innovations and technology. There are some other researchers and analysts that have tried to map my milestones in the countdown to a curve. And some of those curves, some of those charts show 2025, maybe 2026. It actually all depends on the communication of that progress. So it might be right now a lab like Google or OpenAI or Anthropic have an AGI system in their lab and they haven't told anyone. I'm relying on published papers, media reports, and other insider info to be able to say, well, this is what they've actually got. They've got a GPT-6 equivalent built into a humanoid robot like Neo, and it's able to assemble IKEA furniture and complete the SAT in the 99th percentile. That's all it's going to take, and we're really, really close to that.
So there could be theoretically an AGI that exists already that's maybe siloed in some warehouse or a data center that just hasn't been released. But at least by the public information that's given so far, we're currently, again, like you said, at 76%, potentially on track to reach that 100% level by 2025 next year or 2026.
Absolutely. And people can read through my justifications of each of those milestones at lifearchitect.ai/AGI. It's a really long page now. It wasn't back in 2020, 2021, but there are probably 50 or 60 as a guess milestones that have been listed. And they take us all the way back to the perceptron and Turing's research from the 1940s.
Given that you're saying that this could potentially be only a year or two away, what does 100% AGI look like? And I mean, is this an earth-shattering type of event?
So there are two important keywords to understand here. The first is AGI, artificial general intelligence, a machine that performs at the level of an average or median human. So think about your peers, think about the people that you see around you in your workplace, and look for that 50th percentile person, that average person with an IQ of 100, being very average. Getting a machine to that space, I don't think is going to be very difficult, and there's not much left to get there. The other keyword to know is ASI, artificial superintelligence. That's a machine that performs at the level of an expert human in practically any field. So to achieve AGI, and some people think we're already there, we just have to hit the 50th percentile and have an average human that can interact with the world. To hit ASI, which might come within a year or two after AGI, that one is going to be astronomical. That will be, as some say, a culmination of all intelligence on Earth and beyond. So think of new inventions, new discoveries, new ways of harnessing energy, and really that changes both the entire Earth, the universe, and the way that we evolve as humans.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, we could be looking at, if the current progress that we've seen over the past few years, if that continues, it's exponential in nature. If we see that continue, we could be looking at AGI over the next year or two. We could potentially be looking at artificial superintelligence, ASI, another year or two after that, which means within this decade, we could be facing artificial superintelligence. And there are a lot of fears around that, of course, just in terms of how earth-shattering that would be for human civilization. I know you line more on the optimistic side of things. Some people would just push back and say, we'll never get there. That's just not going to happen. AI is still too dumb. It can't write code perfectly like a human can. There's a number of areas that perhaps you could cite where it's either underperforming or it just can't achieve certain levels of standards or thresholds that people would consider to get us to AGI or ASI. What would you say to some of the detractors of what you just said?
I don't engage with those guys, Chris. It's just a lack of information. Look, there's a lot of research and analysis at lifearchitect.ai that will guide people through that. There's an entire page called IQ Testing AI. And like the metrics we just mentioned, it's really visible right there in black and white on what's happening. I'm talking about it achieving in the 99th percentile for creativity on the gold standard Torrance tests, And even if we look at psychology, so the theory of mind, which is putting yourself in other people's shoes, it didn't just achieve in the 99th percentile, it actually hit the ceiling. It scored 100% in this theory of mind, which is a psychology test. When we go back to logic and exams, it's outperforming the average human significantly. We've seen it hit 90, 100% in some exams. And while there are things that we are exploring, things that we are looking at to improve its reasoning, to improve its truthfulness, to improve its speed and its performance, those things are going to be really simple to iron out. And I don't see any blocks on the way to ASI or our very, very rapidly approaching AGI.
Yeah, and it seems to me that when I speak to people about this issue, there are a number of philosophical presuppositions that many make, just in terms of their own worldview. And for decades, as I've had this conversation with people on understanding the progress of artificial intelligence or whether or not it is not just sci-fi, it seems the most common response is that it's going to stop at some point. Yeah, basically, you're just going to see AI hit a ceiling. And it's interesting because you started your most recent memo with a quote showing even the difference between those who actually work and are designing these models, who are on the cutting edge of developing and implementing these, versus what most people think. Do you mind telling us a little bit about, that quote and what even those working in the field are kind of preparing for?
Yeah, that quote was from PhD candidate James Campbell, who's got a lot of backing. He's been around the block in terms of academic institutions. He's been at Berkeley and Cornell and Johns Hopkins. But he's essentially saying the guys who are buried in these labs, and that kind of does put blinkers on them. It does give us a particular focus and perspective that is outside of the norm of the public view. Those guys are saying very soon that the upcoming eschaton or end of history is imminent, and that people like Geoffrey Hinton as well, who's left Google fairly recently, are counting down, putting their affairs in order and getting ready for this real peak of human evolution. I don't know what happens next, but I do know that the performance of these models, the concept of superintelligence, are all coming to a head where humans, like I said in my report many years ago now, are becoming irrelevant, particularly in the case of intelligence. And I think that's what's most exciting for me, is that we do get access to augmenting and amplifying our natural intelligence.
Yeah, and I thought that this part of the quote was very interesting, where you have here that this is from, again, James Campbell at Berkeley, Cornell, and Johns Hopkins, saying that, when you look at the various people that are working, creating these large language models at all these different companies, most of the staff at the secretive top labs are seriously planning their lives around the existence of digital gods in 2027, which again aligns with what you were saying about how we could be looking at artificial superintelligence before this decade is over. So very disruptive changes. And I think, if anyone that's listening thinks that what we're saying is really out there, I would just encourage all of you to pay attention to Dr. Alan D. Thompson's research and work at lifearchitect.ai, to follow his newsletter, The Memo, which is going to cover all of this information. And Dr. Allen, before we close, I do want to ask you, because you've always been such a tremendous resource of info, not just in terms of what's happening with the latest developments, but also very practical applications in terms of the tools. You were the first one that told me about Poe.com, which I use religiously now for all sorts of different AI applications. You have a number of things that I know that you're working with and using. Any other tools do you think our audience should be aware of if they're, either they have their own business or, if they're involved in the creative industry? Any other tools you think would be worth mentioning that could be of some use?
So I've just finished writing a 22-page paper on GPT-5's data set, and I pushed that paper out, the first draft of that paper, in about 3 or 4 hours. I started it at 6 p.m. I was pretty happy with it at 10 p.m. The only reason I was able to do that was using Claude 3.5 Sonnet via Poe.com and GPT-4o within the ChatGPT interface, because it allowed me to interact with CSV files. You can literally give it a CSV file, ask it to manipulate it, ask it to combine CSVs, dump in, just paste in text, and it will add that as another column and even do calculations for you. It is like magic. And then Claude 3.5 Sonnet actually helped me with copy editing, some writing, and certainly with formatting some of the paper. The AI tools now are pretty incredible, but I rely on those two. The latest frontier model, Claude 3.5 Sonnet in Poe.com, and GPT-4o, still one of the highest performing models. And that particular interface does have a kind of tool use that allows you to input and output documents.
Yeah, and again, those are available through Poe.com, which is nice. And I also use OpenAI's GPT-4o through Poe.com for all sorts of stuff. Also, Perplexity.ai you can use for web search. OpenAI now also releasing its preliminary model for web search, which I'd like to get your thoughts on that. The thinking is that now that OpenAI is taking a stab into search, that this could be stealing some market share from Google. Any thoughts on that?
SearchGPT is actually based on WebGPT, which was a paper released by OpenAI back in 2021. Again, we keep going 3 years back. John Schulman was a lead author on the WebGPT paper, and he must have hit the pause button on WebGPT because he then went and wrote ChatGPT. And of course, we all saw how noisy that was at the end of 2022. Here we are, probably 3 and a little bit years later from the WebGPT paper, and they've just done the same thing. They've tied in the large language model to web search, and now they're monetizing it. And I think they've done the right thing by allowing the public to interact with conversation and dialogue via ChatGPT first for a year or two, and then show them what's actually possible when you hook it up to the World Wide Web.
So do you think Google is facing some competition on its search business here?
I'd like to see it first. I don't believe this has been released yet. It's just been announced. I'd like to see how truthful it is, whether it has access to live search results or not, whether it has some of the proprietary partnerships and cooperations and collaborations that Google has, particularly with the news outlets, and to see its accuracy. I think it might be a little bit easier to outperform Google these days with the decline of Google search quality, but let's wait and see.
Yeah, and I typically use for web search Perplexity.ai, and the reason is it provides a very easy readable format with all of the links and sources that it uses, and then you can also expand that out. It'll give you a full digest. That's not something that is common to a number of other web searches. If SearchGPT were able to incorporate that, that would be very powerful, because I think a lot of people do want to be able to, even if they are going to read the answers that come up from the search after you prompt it, you obviously want to see where is this information being pulled from, and then fact check it yourself, which you just have to do nowadays no matter what.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's still triple checking necessary. I think with the next frontier model, GPT-5 and its contemporaries, we will see really, really deep reasoning. And it might even be that it goes and double checks its answers before it gives a response.
And lastly, one last tidbit that I'd like to get your thoughts on, if you have any insights on this. Apple, again, just releasing and announcing its Apple Intelligence. Apple has been late to the game on a lot of this stuff. Of course, they did have Siri. They've had Siri for many, many years. That is a rudimentary form of AI, we could probably say. But any thoughts on, kind of where Apple is and playing catch up now?
I think the main thing with Apple Intelligence is that it allows AI to become ubiquitous. So ChatGPT opened access to these large language models from, a few million people in 2020, maybe less, to 200 million plus per month, according to OpenAI, with the release of ChatGPT. Apple does that even better. Now that we've got this built into our phones, if you look at the count of iOS devices out there, it's measured in the billions. So we've really now got ubiquitous access across regions, if you think of some of the lower socioeconomic countries, have now got access to these large language models, and they've really got access to a kind of super intelligence.
Well, we've been speaking with one of the world's top-ranking researchers and consultants in the AI and robotics space, Dr. Alan D. Thompson. Alan, it is always a pleasure to get your thoughts and analysis and just get an update on what's happening. You're following all of these developments, again, tracking these things, providing hard-hitting research and data for governments, Fortune 500 companies. As we close, what would be the best way for our listeners to sign up to your newsletter and follow more of your research in the future?
I'd love to invite you to join 10,000 plus subscribers now in 142 countries. And if I listed out the clients there, it would basically be every major company, every major government on earth. I do get frequent emails that governments use it for their policy analysis and decision making. But you can grab that at lifearchitect.ai/memo.
And Alan, just in case you're wondering, if you do have the US government now following you, I do have to take credit for that about 2 years ago. So I pitched it to their main person there.
Legend. Thanks, Chris.
All right, Alan, well, it was a pleasure to have you on. We look forward to speak with you in the future. Everyone, just want to highlight a few key points from today's interview that are worth repeating. First off, as we discussed, AI is now outperforming the average human on nearly every test. Furthermore, it is also outperforming human experts on more and more tests as well. You can see this with a series of charts that Alan has put together showing where AI compares across a wide range of exams covering everything from the SAT exam, the bar exam, economics, medical knowledge, and reasoning tests, and others. If you want to take a look at some of these up-to-date charts, I'll have a link where this interview is posted on Financial Sense. And one other important point that should probably be made about today's interview is that AI is not just outperforming humans on exams and tests related to specific fields of study, but also in various tests and competitions that require creativity and more qualitative aspects of intelligence and reasoning that were once thought the sole domain of humans. As Alan said today, at the current rate of progress, we may only be 1 or 2 years away from artificial general intelligence and perhaps only another 2 to 4 years away from artificial super intelligence. This forecast from Alan that he made today, we should point out, is a bit more aggressive than Ray Kurzweil, one of the leading tech futurists and forecasters, who thinks we'll see AI reach human-level intelligence in about 5 years, with something more akin to super intelligence, or ASI, another 2 decades away, according to Ray Kurzweil. I guess we'll just have to see how things play out, but one thing is for certain: we aren't yet seeing a plateau in performance or new benchmarks being broken by these large language models. Another important point, as we touched on in the first half of today's show, we are seeing rapid advancements in brain-machine interfaces. We have Elon Musk's Neuralink and also Synchron in Australia, as well as a dozen or so other smaller companies that now allow people to use their thoughts to control a digital device. The FDA and other governments have already approved this for people with severe disabilities and are currently being used for this very purpose. But as Alan said, the next step is widening out that envelope to people with less severe cognitive impairments. Then, within the not too distant future, we'll move from resolving physical disabilities and cognitive impairments to the wild, wild west of intelligence augmentation. This will start out first with non-invasive brain-machine or brain-computer interfaces, as we've discussed on the show previously, but eventually move into surgically implanted or invasive BMIs where anyone can have access to the latest large language model and interact with their devices telepathically. Again, this is not sci-fi. This technology is already being used and has shown to be highly effective. It's just a matter of time before intelligence augmentation reaches the masses. As we've discussed on the show in the past, it may be that we will see it first in a country like China, where the government is plowing ahead in this area. Needless to say, the allure of a brain-machine interface enabling direct telepathic connectivity to a godlike intelligence will undoubtedly be irresistible for many people. It's no surprise then that researchers developing these models are already contemplating and preparing for a radically transformed future, one that was relegated to the realm of science fiction just a few short years ago. For FS Insider, I'm Chris Sheridan. Thanks for listening.
The Financial Sense News Hour is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered as a solicitation or offer to purchase or sell any securities. The investments, investment strategies, and investment philosophies discussed or presented on the News Hour each involve their own unique risk factors, which are not discussed on the show. Responses to listener inquiries are based on the personal opinions of the Financial Sense staff and do not take into account listener suitability, objectives, or risk tolerance. Financial Sense News Hour and its parent company shall not be liable for any financial losses that result from investing in any companies mentioned in Financial Sense or arising out of the use of any material on the News Hour. Be advised that you invest at your own risk.